Welcome so much. This is a Herefordshire Citizens Assembly, Climate Assembly. Thank you so much for giving up your time to be part of this really exciting opportunity for Herefordshire. This is the first Citizens Assembly that Herefordshire Council have commissioned. So, we're really excited about doing this. It's been a long time in the planning, so it's fantastic to see so many of your faces on the screen. I'm Claire from Impact Consultancy, and I'm one of the lead facilitators for the Assembly. The other lead facilitator is sitting alongside me, not in her own home in Herefordshire. This is Sarah, and together we will guide you through the Assembly process. So we hope you are as excited about taking part as we are, but we also understand this might feel quite a daunting experience for some of you, and we want to reassure you that we've got a brilliant team of people here to support us through the process. So I'm going to do some introductions first before we get too far in. So as we've already said, we've got 5 fantastic group facilitators working with you today and over the course of the next 2 weekends. We've got Paul, Lauren, Mary, Kath and Vicky, and they will be working with you closely when you go into your breakout sessions. Production support is provided by the Queen of Zoom, Max, who you've already all met on other training sessions that she's been running with you. We've already introduced Frances to you. She's going to be there to provide IT support. If you've got any tech issues at all, just get in contact with Frances and she'll be able to talk you through those. We've also got wellbeing support provided, and that's being provided tonight by Nigel from March's counselling service. And again, you can direct message him in chat if you need any particular support. And we're joined by Natalia Silva. So Natalia is Director for Corporate Services from Herefordshire Council, and she's going to be here with us throughout the Assembly to answer any particular questions you might have in relation to Herefordshire Council. So she can come into those breakout rooms and answer your questions as they arise. We're also joined by Sandra Howgate. So Sandra is an illustrator and a graphic recorder, and she's going to be capturing your conversations by visually drawing them. And she's going to present her drawings back to us on this next Thursday when we meet again. And we'll use those pictures and images as an aid memoir for you as we go through our conversations. So housekeeping, we'll go through a bit more housekeeping in a while, but there's just a couple of things I just wanted to remind you really. So as Max has already said, we are recording all the Q&A sessions. That's a prerequisite of doing a citizens assembly. They have to be recorded, but we won't be recording any of the breakout discussions we have. They remain confidential. So when you just split into your small groups, we won't be recording those sessions. As Max said, if you're uncomfortable about being on camera at any point, feel free just to turn your videos off. Because obviously there's such a large number of us, we won't be taking questions from the floor in these kind of sessions. You will be muted, but obviously once you move into your smaller groups, you will be unmuted at that point. The main message from us, from the whole of the support team really, is to enjoy this experience. As I said, it's a unique experience. It's really exciting. Don't panic if the tech goes wrong. It may well happen to all of us at some point. But as I say, Frances is on hand to sort that out. So what are we going to be doing this evening? So we're going to explain to you a bit more about why Herefordshire Council are doing a Citizens Climate Assembly and what they want to get out of it, and what they're going to do with the recommendations around priority areas for action that you come up with. We will give you some time to get to know the people you're going to be working with. So you're going to be working in the same groups tonight and on Saturday, and then we'll switch those groups around on Sunday. We're going to hear from our first panel of speakers to help you kind of understand more about what climate change is, why it's important and how it impacts on us all and what we can do about it. And after you've heard from those speakers, you'll have the chance to come up with questions for those speakers, and we'll do a Q&A with those speakers, so you'll get time with each of them. We're also going to spend some time with you tonight developing some conversation guidelines together. And that will make sure that we can have really productive conversations with everybody, and so that everybody feels like they can take part in those conversations. And obviously at the end of tonight's session, we'll tell you a little bit more about what we're going to be doing at the weekend. And we will have a 5 minutes, not a very long one, but a 5-minute break in the middle of this session. So We're now going to have a formal welcome by Councillor Hitchener, who's the leader of the council. And after that, we'll hear from Councillor Chowns, who is Cabinet Member for Environment and Economy at Herefordshire Council, who will talk briefly about why Herefordshire Council have decided to hold a Citizens' Climate Assembly and talk to you about the focus of the Assembly and how the recommendations you come up with will be used. So it's over to you, leader of the council.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you for everybody to participating in this fantastic event. As Claire said, it's innovative. It is tremendously exciting. I do wish I was there with you participating in this. One of the fascinating things for me is that here are 48 people who've been selected in a, I would say random, but it's not quite so random. But you probably don't know each other, and I think that's absolutely amazing to bring all these people together. So it's a thank you to you all for participating, and we all look forward to the results. What partly fascinates me is here are 48 people who probably have never been really involved with the council and involved in this kind of event or democracy in this kind of way. And I hope that you will find it as a really positive experience and that you'll want to participate in the future with the council and with these sorts of issues. So I'm going to keep this very short. Thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to the results of this assembly. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Councillor Hitchener. We're now just going to show you the presentation, which is a pre-recorded presentation by Councillor Chowns, but Councillor Chowns is here with us this evening, so she'll be part of the Q&A session.
Obviously just coming.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Herefordshire Citizens Climate Assembly. I'm Councillor Ellie Chowns, one of the councillors, and I'm the Cabinet Member for Economy and Environment at Herefordshire Council. And I want to start just by saying an enormous thank you to all of you for being part of this. I think it's going to be a really exciting process, and I'm so grateful to you for putting your time and energy into your deliberations over the coming hours, days, and a couple of weeks. Now, why are we holding a citizens' assembly? Well, we want to bring people together to help identify solutions to shared challenges. And we want to find ways to help to hear voices that aren't necessarily always heard in our political debate, because we think that'll help to make our democracy stronger. So a citizens' assembly is a tried and tested way of doing this. For example, the UK Parliament set one up to look at climate change in 2020, but they've been used to look at other issues too, like social care. So that's why we're trying this in Herefordshire. And we've chosen climate change as the topic because we recognise the enormous urgency of the challenge that we face with climate change. And that's been highlighted by the recent Global Climate Change Summit in Glasgow that was held just a couple of months ago. Now, back in March 2019, Herefordshire councillors of all political parties unanimously voted to recognise the climate emergency. There's a cross-party consensus on this. And we also recognise that tackling climate change has lots of other benefits too. So, for example, if we insulate people's houses to reduce emissions, then we also help make them have warmer houses. We create jobs, we reduce fuel bills. So tackling climate change is really a win-win issue. Now, how have we organised the Assembly? Well, we've used expert organisations with lots of experience to help us set this up. So, for example, to help select a representative group of participants, all of yourselves. We asked independent experts, such as academics, to be on an advisory group to advise us on the structure and the content and the speakers. And we also held several stakeholder meetings towards the end of last year, got really good levels of attendance and engagement from people in Herefordshire, and they made loads of good suggestions for topics and speakers too. So we've used all of that, taken it together. Based on that input, the advisory group has agreed that the Assembly should focus on 3 key themes, and they are buildings, including housing, transport, and food, farming and land use. And those 3 themes, the choice of that is because they're the most important parts of our county's climate footprint, i.e. the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions from Herefordshire. And you'll look at the details of that, the statistics, on Saturday morning. Now, of course, these three themes are all linked together with each other and with other themes such as consumption and waste. But those three, buildings, transport, and food farming and land use, are the areas where A, they're our biggest climate challenges, and B, where we felt that the Assembly members could have the most added value in terms of contributing to policy decisions. So what do we hope the Assembly will do? Well, over the coming sessions, you're going to hear about the scale of these challenges, existing good practice, both in Herefordshire and more widely, and crucially, options for what we can do more or better or differently. And we're asking you to consider all of these things and then say what you think should be done based on your deliberations and discussions together. We hope that you'll recommend principles and priorities for climate action, responding to that question that frames the whole of the Assembly, which is how should Herefordshire meet the challenges of climate change? Now, in terms of using the findings of this Assembly, well, the Council itself intends to use the Assembly's recommendations in two ways. First, to inform policy, and second, to help us decide on priorities for climate action. So Assembly recommendations are going to inform policy decisions such as the new core strategy or local plan. So, for example, in relation to building standards and transport planning, we'll be using your findings and recommendations to inform decision making through those processes. But also we want to use Assembly recommendations to help us make decisions about new projects. So our coalition administration intends to put £1.33 million additional funding into climate action in the budget decision making that's going to happen next month, February. We intend to use the Assembly's recommendations to help us to kind of shape decisions on what exactly that money should be spent on and anything else that we can manage to do for climate change too. But it's not just all about the council, because of course more than 99% of Herefordshire's climate footprint is outside the direct control of the council itself. We all need to work together to tackle this challenge. So we really hope that others will use the findings of the Assembly too. We want it to inspire action through businesses, community members, individuals, groups, inspiring all of us together to take climate action. And actually the council has set up a county-wide climate and nature partnership, which will play a key role in taking forward the recommendations of this Assembly. So the purpose of it overall is to bring people together to identify these principles and priorities for climate action, to help shape what the council does, but also more broadly to help identify how everyone in Herefordshire, all of us, can work together, businesses, community groups, individuals, working together to tackle the climate challenge. Well, at the same time, of course, that'll help us to address other challenges that we share, like creating good jobs and helping people live healthy lives and supporting thriving communities. So basically, I hope that the Assembly will help us to identify that common ground and inspire us all to further action. So I just want to thank you again so much for being part of this and wish you all the very, very best for your deliberations. Thank you.
Okay, so that's if you have any particular questions that you want to ask Ellie, she's going to be part of the Q&A session that you're going to be part of later. But I would just urge you, if you haven't already written those questions down, just to kind of jot them down quickly, just so you don't forget them. Okay, so before we go on any further, I'm just going to give you an opportunity to get to know some of the other people that you're going to be working with in your group for the rest of today, tonight, and on Saturday. So we're going to move you into your virtual breakout rooms in a minute with your facilitators, and they're going to take you through a short icebreaker exercise. So we will be working a lot like this through the course of the Assembly. We'll be moving into small groups, and then we'll be bringing you back together for full group Q&A sessions. And you'll notice that when you're in those small breakout rooms, you'll get notifications about how much time you have left for your discussions. That's not something you need to worry about, though. That's what the facilitator's role is. It's to make sure you kind of keep to time and keep on task. But you will might find it a bit odd because you kind of automatically get moved in and out of these rooms. Don't worry about that either. It will all be done for you, so you don't need to worry about any of that. As I said, you'll always have an experienced facilitator in your group when you're in small groups. Their role is to steer you through your discussions, to ensure everyone feels able to contribute, to help you deliberate and discuss the topics you're going to be covering. The facilitator's role is to remain impartial throughout the process, so they won't be there to share their opinions with you, and they're not actually able to answer your questions on content of sessions, just the process, but you'll be able to call people that can answer your questions into those sessions as and when you need them. So I'm going to let you move into those breakout rooms now, to just spend a little time getting to know each other.
Okay, I think we're all back.
So,
Claire, you're muted.
sorry, I've muted everybody, Claire.
Okay, so I've already fallen foul of the talking when I'm meant to be unmuted, so I won't be the first person to do that, I'm sure. So welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed spending a bit of time getting to know your other group members better. You're going to work really closely with each other over the course of the next few days, and as I said, we'll kind of mix you up on the Sunday, and we'll mix you up in totally different groups for the next weekend session. So I'm just going to share a few housekeeping points with you now before we move on to our speakers, and hopefully these points mean we'll all get the most out of the time we have together, and we'll create a safe and open space where people's privacy and views are respected. So apart from when we're in the small groups, you will always be on mute. That just means that we don't hear any background noise from you. We've got an awful lot to get through, an awful packed kind of programme for you over the next few days. So we need to make sure we really keep to time and to topic. So we'd be really grateful if when we have breaks, you can come back from those breaks as soon as possible. Just a reminder as well that these discussions that we're having within sessions are confidential. So please don't share content about the sessions or discussions via social media. Please also don't record the sessions or take any photographs during the sessions. And all of this, I know, has already been shared with you through the guidelines on Basecamp. As I said, we've got a short break scheduled in for about halfway through today's session for you to kind of have a bit of a comfort break. But I'm going to hand over now to Sarah, who's going to introduce our first panel of speakers to you.
That's great. Thank you, Claire, and really nice to see everybody here this evening. Just to remind you, I'm the other lead facilitator. So we're now going to hear from our first two external speakers. The first one, Rachel Coxcoon, is going to tell us a little bit more about what climate change is and why it's happening. And then she's going to do a second presentation on the impacts of climate change. And then we're going to hear from Paul Allen from the Centre for Alternative Technology, CAT, who's going to tell us a little bit more about what we can do about climate change. So you're going to hear each recording. It's a pre-recorded presentation, and you're going to hear one after the other. But just to remind you then that the people that are speaking will join us live for a Q&A. So there will be the chance to ask questions. So I'm going to hand over to Max now to do the presentations. And just before we start, as a reminder, please listen with an open mind, capture down any key points, write down any questions, and there'll be time for reflection at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Rachel and I'm here to talk to you about the background science as to what causes the climate to change, and this will be the underpinning for all the discussions that you have further on in the Climate Assembly over the next few weeks. So we're going to look at what's caused the climate to change. And then afterwards, there'll be a separate presentation from me about what the impacts of that will be on humanity and on other species and so on. But before we start, I want to clear up a fairly common misconception you hear a lot in the newspapers and so on, which is this difference between weather and climate. Weather, obviously, we're very good at talking about in the UK. It's those short-term changes about whether it's raining today or not, whether it's cloudy and so on and so forth. Climate describes the average weather conditions in a certain region, which can be as big as a whole continent, over a long period of time. So about 30 years is normally used in climate modelling. And a really useful analogy for you to think about is as the human body. When people talk about climate change and scientists are talking about, they're talking about 1 degree of average temperature change, and people think, well, this is nothing. And in terms of day-to-day weather, you're absolutely right. When we think about it's 20 degrees one day in the summer and then it's 24 degrees the next day, that 4 degrees change is just the difference between a quite warm day and a very warm day. And it can fluctuate quite wildly when we're talking about daily weather. But in terms of the global climate system, think of it like the human body. When you have a fever, or your child has a fever, we start to get worried with these very small rises in temperatures, these 1 degree, half a degree, 2 degrees above the normal, because that's what throws the whole system out of kilter. So when we talk about climate change, every fraction of a degree of the average global temperature, the change in that is very important. When we talk about weather, which is driven by climate, but is not the same thing, these kind of much bigger changes in temperature throughout the year and throughout a month or even a week are really quite normal. So there's another background concept that I'll need to explain to you, and then it leads on to us talking about greenhouse gases, which I'm sure you've all heard about in the news. The carbon cycle is something that scientists describe to describe how a particular element, carbon, cycles throughout the oceans, the rocks, so the sediment and so on of the world, and the atmosphere. And there is a cycle that has been going for millions and millions and millions of years. And when carbon enters the atmosphere, the principal form that it enters the atmosphere in is as carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, so it has the ability to trap warmth. And there are others, and I will explain them to you in a moment. And without certain gases in the atmosphere that can trap warmth, actually the Earth wouldn't be, life on Earth wouldn't have evolved the way we understand it. It's kept warm by this blanket of gases. And this cycle has sort of fluctuated over millions of years. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere have been higher in the past than they are today, but pre-humanity, and various other things around the Earth were different at the time, such as there was no ice anywhere on the Earth's surface. And this cycle is kind of pretty much in balance. It fluctuates over geological time, and it's linked to temperatures. But what humanity has done in the last 250 years is access, which you can sort of see down in the bottom of the sort of underground part of this diagram. We've sort of accessed an underground vault of carbon stores that were not part of that accounting system, where they were in infinitesimally small amounts, were sort of coming out through sedimentation and entering water and oceans over millions of years. What mankind has done is access that underground vault in the form of coal, oil and gas, and sort of at a rapid rate, a geological blink of an eye, has pushed that into the system by burning it and sending it up into the atmosphere. And so we're really, really adding to that blanket. It's like adding extra layers of insulation to the Earth at a very, very rapid rate. And we measure this in terms of atmospheric CO2, how many parts per million of CO2 are in the atmosphere. And we're up, this graph is actually a couple of years old now, we're over at 400 parts a million now, whereas before the Industrial Revolution, it was 270 parts per million. So the important thing to take away is this confusion I mentioned earlier. People say, oh, but the greenhouse effect is just natural and it's always happened and, it's just a natural thing. We don't need to worry about it. And this is where I want to just separate that out. And I hope that those previous diagrams showed you, yes, there is a greenhouse effect. Yes, there are a group of gases that can help keep the Earth warm and keeps temperatures stable. But no, what we're seeing now is not a natural phenomenon. This is the actions of humanity accessing stores of carbon particularly, as well as some other gases that were not part of that global accounting system in a stable way, and injecting it very rapidly. And it is that speed of change that is important. Systems, ecological systems, and even human systems cannot respond that quickly to changes in temperature and in the environment around them. So I've mentioned greenhouse gases, so I better explain what they are, because they tend to just be talked about as greenhouse gas. The one that is talked about most often and is always quite often even used as shorthand for the others is carbon dioxide, which you will hear referred to as just carbon, which is technically incorrect, but we'll let that carry on because it's embedded in. Carbon dioxide is both up there in the largest quantity, and it's also the longest lived. Once we emit carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it persists for a couple of hundred years, and that's a problem because that means there's a lag effect to everything humanity does. If we stopped emitting everything tomorrow, there would be a lag effect of having to deal with what we've already put up there. And when we talk about comparing greenhouse gas emissions from nation to nation and so on, one thing we often do is we convert other gases into units of CO2. So we talk about carbon emissions, but what we've done is converted all the other warming gases into units. So we give carbon dioxide a global warming potential of 1, and that's the ability of carbon dioxide to, for every ton that gets put up there, its ability to warm the atmosphere. And then we can convert others into units of CO2 for easier accounting. So methane, the next one on this diagram, is about 25 to 30 times more warming per ton of methane that goes up into the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, but it's much shorter lived. It starts to degrade after about 10 years. Then we have nitrous oxide, which you can see is about nearly 300 times more warming per unit that gets sent up there. And then we have this family of gases called the F gases, which are sort of synthetic gases. Those of you who are at least as old as me will remember we worried about a hole in the ozone layer back in the 1980s, and that was being caused by a reaction between CFC, chlorofluorocarbon gases that mankind was using in aerosols and refrigeration and some industrial processes. And as they escaped the atmosphere, they interacted with the ozone layer and made a hole in it, and that was causing various issues. When it was realized what was causing that problem, a lot of work, international agreements came out, and we agreed to phase those out, and they were replaced with these F gases, which unfortunately have turned out to be very warming indeed. So they now need phasing out themselves. But concentrating on the other three, the three big gases, let's just have a quick look at where they come from and think about what that means for our behaviour and the impacts for people like us in the UK. So the big one, carbon dioxide, is principally released when we burn any carbon-based material. So back in prehistory, when we were sort of wandering the plains and the Serengeti and so on, this involves this also is if you burn peat, animal dung, wood, piles of dry leaves, any carbon-based matter that you burn will put carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. And prehistory, pre-industrial history, in the main, that was in balance in terms of what humanity was burning in terms of woody biomass and animal dung. The amount of CO2 emitted was sort of sucked back out of the atmosphere by the regrowth of new crops, new trees, and so on and so forth, roughly in balance. By accessing those underground resources of incredibly high energy intensity fuels like coal and so on, which are just animal remains and plant remains that have been crushed over millions of years. So they're like incredibly concentrated energy. We've been able to then start burning those and injecting CO2 into the atmosphere at a rate that cannot be sucked down. The technical word for that is sequestering. We're completely out of balance now. So what we're pulling down in terms of forestry and so on, we're not replacing. But we're also making that problem worse through issues like deforestation. Forests are a net carbon sink, and as we degrade them and as we deforest large areas of the globe, we are taking away one of the biggest sinks that we had. And then the cement industry. If the cement industry was a country, it would have the third biggest CO2 emissions in the world after the US and China. And that's because not only is it energy intensive, but the very process of creating cement produces CO2 as part of that chemical byproduct. The next big gas is methane. Methane comes from a couple of sources. If you let organic waste, food waste and plant waste and so on, and dead animals rot away in an environment with no oxygen, so something like a landfill site, it produces methane. Your home compost bin isn't the same because that's an aerobic system. So that's one big thing, throwing carbon waste into landfills and so on is very bad. Livestock, ruminant livestock, cows and sheep that have more than one stomach, they produce far more methane. And as humanity has got very into eating red meat over the last half a century at least, we are producing far more livestock emissions by orders of magnitude than we ever were before. But also, again, the fossil fuel industry is implicated here. Fugitive emissions of methane is what it's called, whereby when you extract oil and gas from under the ground, methane also escapes from those resources. And that is a much bigger proportion than was previously thought. And then we have nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide pre the Second World War wasn't really too much of an issue. We moved away from organic animal dung-based fertilizers globally at that point into synthetic, man-made, nitrogen-based fertilizers, and that has caused a rocketing in nitrous oxide emissions. So before I move on, I just want to, again, clear up a misconception around plastic pollution and climate change. Lots of people, when I ask them about climate change, and they say, oh, yes, I really worry about it, and so I recycle my plastic. Plastic pollution is actually it's obviously linked in that we're stressing environments all around the world that are already stressed, but plastic pollution is not a key driver of climate change. I hope you will have taken away from the previous few slides the key things we are doing to cause emissions that force the climate to be warmer. We're burning things to keep our homes and buildings warm. We're burning things to drive our vehicles around. We're producing a lot of cement. We're producing a lot of red meat. We're cutting down a lot of forests. And we're using a lot of synthetic fertilizers and land, and we're damaging soil, and even that is releasing carbon. Plastic pollution is a major environmental issue that is causing untold and in some cases irreversible damage to particularly marine ecosystems. So I'm not suggesting it's not a problem that we need to solve, but it isn't a key driver of the climate crisis. So if we look at where our emissions globally have come from, I'm going to show you just two graphs now, and it shows you the sort of history of emissions. We've got this yellow chunk, which is Europe, largely Britain being the main source of emissions of what was being produced, man-made emissions back in the 1750s. It was mostly the UK. And then we see globalization, really, that turquoise section is the USA. And then much later, sort of the 1970s onwards, you see China and Asia Pacific coming online. And that's like the history of globalization, stuff moving across from Europe to the US and across the Pacific for production purposes. And that's of what was being done in any given year, who was doing it. But this graph is much more frightening. This is saying of what was being done in any given year, what's the total and who was doing it. And what the takeaway message is, this is not a problem we inherited from our Victorian forefathers. They knew about it and they warned us about it, but it is our generations. This is a post-war problem. The rate at which we have created climate-forcing emissions shot up after the 1945 end of the Second World War, and actually increased again after about 1990, which is around about the time that there was enough scientific consensus for us to have come together and signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. 50% of the emissions that are causing this problem have been put into the atmosphere since 1990. So you can see here that, as I said, there have always been fluctuations in that natural carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere over geological time. But what this graph is showing you, and again, it's 2-3 years old now, is how much that acceleration has happened. It's vertical. There's not even a sort of slope to that over the last just a couple of 100 years. And it's that rate of change that is the damaging thing. And this is where we see that we are now seeing definite increases in global temperatures on land and at sea. And as I said, when we think about it in like a human body, these very small temperature rises are very important. And we've known about it for a long time. The principle that CO2 could warm the earth was established by a scientist called Eunice Foote in the USA in the mid-1850s. Her work was built on by various other people, prominent one, Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish scientist who did lots of calculations on this in the late 1800s and pretty much predicted what would happen. We have Edward Teller, the famous US physicist, sometimes known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, warning the American petroleum industry about this in the late 50s in a keynote speech, and Exxon's own internal research showing that this was likely to be a problem in the 70s. And James Hansen from NASA giving testimony to the US Senate in 1988, which really stimulated some of that UN work. And we will find when later on, when you have other speakers, we'll be talking more about, so why has no action been taken? So I'm not really going to cover that now, but you should be aware that we've known about this a long time. And there is now a scientific consensus. We have very, very strong evidence in which there are very, very high levels of confidence from thousands of scientists working around the world that this is a man-made problem. This figure is from the IPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report from August 2021, showing that report was, put together by authors from across the world using more than 14,000 scientific references. And it couldn't be clearer. The advice from science couldn't be clearer. The world is already warmer. If it gets warmer, every fraction of a degree counts. We are looking at whether it is even possible to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees at this point, not because that's a good target that we want to aim for, but because at this point it's the least worst outcome. And without radical change, it's not likely to be achieved. And these fractions of a degree matter. 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees global warming is the difference between millions and millions more people being exposed to the kind of heat that kills, or the Arctic Ocean being free of sea ice once in a decade as opposed to once in a century, and all the knock-on effects that could have on food chains and so forth. So I'm going to wrap that up there with the climate science, and we'll look at what that means for us in terms of impacts a bit later. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much to Rachel for that presentation, which I hope you've all found thought-provoking. We're now going to go
so we looked
straight
at the science
into
of climate change.
second presentation. Sorry, we're now going to go straight into the second presentation from Rachel, which is about the impacts of climate change. Okay, thanks.
While ago and what causes the climate to change, but in a way that's not relevant unless we understand whether or not it will have an impact on us. So that's what we're going to look at now. The impacts of climate change are partly geophysical in terms of changes to the actual physical world, the oceans and so on. And then the knock-on effect of that is how does that affect us as humanity and how does it affect other species? So this bullseye diagram in the center talks about what causes the climate to change, which we've already covered. And then the middle coloured ring, the paler blue ring in the middle, talks about the changes to the world itself. And the obvious takeaway message is that everything will become warmer. So warmer air, warmer oceans and warmer land. And warmer oceans particularly leads to the melting of ice, and ice caps melting resulting in rising sea levels is one of the more obvious results that most people already know about. But there are some less obvious results that occur when the ocean warms, such as ocean acidification, which you can see at the bottom of that central ring. As the oceans get warmer, some of the gases kind of dissolve out of them, and the water that's left behind is slightly more acidic. And that has a real big knock-on effect on a lot of sea creatures whose shells and body parts are made of calcium-based elements, which means they're much more susceptible then to damage from the water. They're living in a more acidic environment and they can't react quickly enough. There's no time to evolve to this new environment. We also see with this additional water entering, lots and lots of fresh water from melting ice, that we see that changes how ocean currents work. And that's very important because a lot of different countries' weather systems are driven ultimately by ocean currents, including the UK's actually. The Gulf Stream that keeps us warmer and milder than a lot of other places that we share a latitude with is driven by a much bigger circulatory current in the oceans, which has sort of been wandering a bit and fluctuating over the past few decades. And it's one of the reasons why we will expect to see more extreme weather. But in places, for example, where their harvests are reliant on things like the monsoon, you have millions of people facing potential food insecurity and potentially even more severe famines and so on as a result of these changes in ocean currents, and more extreme weather and flooding that we've already seen here. You also hear people talk about this one issue that's in that central ring called global greening, which is sometimes presented as a good thing. You know, if we grow plants under a high CO2 environment, they grow a bit faster and a bit better. But unfortunately, that effect is completely offset by some of these things you then see in the outside ring: forest mortality and increased wildfires, which will also obviously damage crops, droughts, which, you know, any kind of increased growth is sort of offset by the likelihood of water stress and increased droughts and so on. And as we see increased droughts and impacts on food supplies, then obviously that has a knock-on effect on societies. We see movement of people in potentially very large numbers, which obviously then leads to conflict and concern about how do we house and how do we provide for these refugees in numbers that we might never have seen before, as well as what we've already seen here in the UK around flooding, we see things like damage to marine ecosystems, loss of biodiversity as certain key species struggle to survive in a different environment. And also for those of us who live in urban areas, something that we'll have to be really aware of in that outer ring down at the bottom is the idea of heat stress. We will see far more heat waves in the UK, and we need to be prepared for those, particularly in urban areas where the impacts can be far more severe. But also sometimes people are sort of saying, well, it's not really going to be a problem for me in my lifetime, and that just can't really seem to feel a sense of urgency about it. So I want to first bring your attention that it is already happening. We are already seeing more regular extreme weather events in the UK. We are seeing movement of people in other parts of the world as a result of famine and unpredictable harvest, much of which can be linked to a change in climate. But one of the reasons to really prioritise fast movement now and front loading the work that we do is this concept of tipping points in the global climate system. A tipping point is a system change when something changes in such a way that it can't be put back. So a classic example at the top of this map is the Greenland ice sheet. Sounds a bit mad, but it's an ice sheet because it's an ice sheet, and if we melt it, only an ice age can put it back. And once it's melted, Greenland is no longer white as seen from above. It absorbs more heat, just like a black towel on your lawn would absorb more heat than a white towel. And then that has a knock-on effect on the warmth of the ice around the Arctic sea ice, and that has a knock-on effect, and so on and so forth. So there's an element of a domino effect once you start tipping some of these systems. Now, northern polar ice is quite thin. It's only sort of meters thick, really. Southern polar ice down at the South Pole is miles thick in some places. And the total loss of the east and west Antarctic ice sheets would cause about 7 meters or 21 feet of sea level rise globally. And given how many of our major cities are located on the coast, this is of serious concern. In terms of the movement of people, we have so many people who are vulnerable globally to rising sea levels that anything we can do to stop sudden shifts in loss of Antarctic ice is going to be hugely crucial. So I talked about people moving as a result of sea level rises affecting coastal settlements, but we also in the UK don't really think about having to move as a result of heat. But in some parts of the world, people are already living on the edge of what is functionally habitable for the human body, a barely livable hot zone, largely in equatorial Africa, which currently covers about 1% of the world's surface. But by some estimates, that portion could go up by about 19% before the end of this century. And we would then see a band across the whole center, really, of the Earth, that kind of equatorial region, including, places like India, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Indonesia, as well as huge chunks of Africa and South America. And we don't live there, but billions of people are living there at the moment. And the big question really globally is, where will they go? Any idea that we have that this will be a slight warming for us and we're a wealthy country and we'll deal with a few extra floods here and there, but everything else will happen to other people is quite fanciful. There will be significant movement of people on a scale that we haven't seen before. And there's also a moral dimension to that, because many of those countries are the countries who've contributed least to the problem. So for the UK in particular, as I've said, we will see and are seeing more extreme weather events. We will see pest and disease migration as we have fewer cold winters and long cold snaps. We will see fungi, bacteria and insect pests moving north that couldn't get a foothold here before. We're likely to see by the end of this century up to 4 quite significant heat waves a year in the summer period. But despite, seeing much more hot weather in that sense, we will also see more rain, more water will fall on us. And when it does fall, there will be more intensity. So we see that thing like crop damage in the summer when we see high intensity summer storms, and infrastructure damage, as we saw when the railway, for example, on the Devon and Cornwall coast collapsed into the sea about 5 years ago. And I really want, because we're an island, I think it's useful to bring our attention to the coast. We have a lot of coast, though obviously not in Herefordshire. This map is showing areas of the world that will be below annual flood level in 2050. And don't take this to mean that these places will be underwater constantly. That's not what this map says, but it's saying if not defended, they will flood regularly. And some of these places already are defended. We know the Somerset levels is reclaimed from the sea, much of Netherlands that you can see on the map, the Wash, the Humber area, and so on. But we will have to make difficult decisions as a country about the places we can no longer afford to protect from the sea. And if that sounds fanciful and far-fetched, I'll bring your attention to, in Wales, you see Snowdonia National Park. Just south of that, one of those red flood-prone areas, is a village called Fairbourne. And in 2014, the government and the local and Welsh government there decreed that it can no longer be protected from the sea, and the entire settlement, everyone in it, has to relocate by about 2034. And this is really, in a way, the UK's first example of climate migrants, where we're having to make those difficult decisions about what we can continue to protect from the sea. And while they're the first, they certainly won't be the last. We also need to think about impacts on health. Those of you who are old enough to remember 2003 will remember a significant heat wave that covered much of Europe at the time, was particularly acute in France and also here. In France, about 15,000 people died that summer in a very short space of time. And you can see from the map where that sort of black spike in the middle, the graph, sorry, the black spike is the temperature, that's that heat wave. And you can see it was unusual, very unusual for the time. But casting forward to 2050, that's something we need to be preparing for, you know, every year really. And by the end of the century, something that we would think of fondly as a cold, or, you know, a cool summer. And heat waves are really something that people, I think of much less than things like melting ice caps. But they're very important because there is a social dimension. Heat waves are bad for us, you know, they're bad for our health. We see in the NHS records increased mortality, particularly in over 65s, whenever the daily temperatures get above about 32 degrees. And similarly, hot nights, only above about 18 degrees, also causes increases in deaths from certain things like strokes. But when we have hot nights followed by hot days with no respite for 3 or 4 days at a time, a heat wave, we see higher mortality overall, and we see that increasingly across age groups, and it affects lower income and more vulnerable communities more for various reasons. There are issues like people who live in high-rise housing, areas of high noise pollution and air pollution, who can't or won't open their windows, are more likely to suffer the health effects of being stuck in small, poorly ventilated properties in very high temperatures. But we also see that there is a link in the research between heat and conflict. People are more irritable, people are more likely to be violent. We see more deaths from domestic violence. We also sadly see more deaths from suicide and more accidental overdoses from things like sleeping pills and anti-anxiety medications, because, you know, living through a heat wave is stressful. So heat waves and urban heat island effects are something we will really have to be looking at. It's also a security risk. The MOD produces a report every few years called the Strategic Trends Assessment, and that looks at the things that will affect the UK and, you know, they need to be prepared for as our sort of military protectors. And this graph represents their kind of consideration of the current state of play, the threats that are facing us. Anything high up is something the MOD think will have a high impact, and anything across to the left is something that they think they're certain, you know, if it were on the left-hand line, they're absolutely certain it will come to pass. And then the size of the bubble is their kind of assessment of what experts think about this. Does everyone agree on what the outcome will be if this thing happens? So what you don't want to see on this graph is a relatively small bubble quite high up and far across to the left, because that's something that the MOD pretty certain will happen. Everyone agrees what the outcome will be, and the impact on UK society will be high. And that bubble number 10 is climate change. And if you just cast your eye across to the right, you'll see a tiny bubble number 3, pretty much on a level with it in terms of impact. That's weapons of mass destruction. So that just gives you a sense of how seriously the MOD takes this threat. So I'll just finish up here, because the phrase "the climate emergency" has come into the sort of common parlance really as a result of the protests and so on that we've seen. And I think it's important not to think of the climate change as just one enormous problem in terms of how it will affect us. The way I like to characterize it is it's more like a series of small emergencies that will get increasingly severe and increasingly close together, and that will stretch our resilience as communities and as councils and so on to respond. We have here some images. You will remember the floods, I'm sure, from early 2020, which affected Herefordshire and Worcestershire. You know, we've seen Cumbria and Lancashire and places like that regularly flooded in the last few years. And we have to sort of imagine our position where we would have a city like Worcester, top left here, flooded in February 2020, declaring a flood emergency, then being hit with the COVID pandemic, declaring a COVID emergency. What if there had also been a heat wave in the summer of 2020? We would have had a council dealing with 3 declared emergencies, and their ability to deliver their basic services under those circumstances becomes increasingly fragile. So think of this as a test of our resilience, and something that we really need to think about the impacts in all areas of our lives. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Rachel, for that presentation. Difficult to hear, but very necessary for us all to hear given the topic of climate change. I just thought I'd use this minute just to remind people that we do have wellbeing support available. If anybody wants to access that, then you can do that through direct messaging Nigel Wellbeing Support. So Nigel's here with us this evening. There's a separate room set up if anybody does want to talk to Nigel, and that's all confidential. Okay, so we're going to move to our third presentation this evening, which is from Paul Allen, who's the Knowledge and Outreach Coordinator at the Centre for Alternative Technology. And Paul's going to uplift us a little bit more now by describing what we can do about climate change, giving us some of the solutions.
Hello everybody, my name's Paul Allen. I'm from the Centre for Alternative Technology's Zero Carbon Britain team. My role is Knowledge and Outreach Coordinator, and I'd like to share with you some of the reflections we've made on our Zero Carbon Britain work over the past 15 years. Now, the team recognise that a climate emergency is a wicked problem and so needs wicked solutions. Getting to grips with understanding the nature of the problem is vital to solving it. But what do we mean by wicked problems? Well, back in 1973, design theorist Horst Rittel and Melvin Webber developed the term for very complex problems. Problems with feedbacks that feed back on themselves and get worse and worse and worse if you don't act fast enough. Problems that are deeply ingrained in a system, entwined and interlocked with all of the parts of the system. And problems with no single solution that you can just press and it goes away. So the major reason to see climate change as a wicked problem is it contains many amplifying positive feedbacks which make it non-linear. For example, ice reflects most of the sun's heat, but if ice melts, the open sea absorbs much more of the sun's heat. So the more ice melts, the warmer the planet gets. The warmer the planet gets, the more ice melts. Similarly, if the North Pole melts, it releases lots and lots of very powerful greenhouse gases, such as methane. Or if forests catch fire and the increasing rate of forest fires goes up, then forests don't capture carbon, they give all that carbon back into the atmosphere. So these positive amplifying feedbacks make it a very serious problem. And we see it in the news regularly. But what we need to do is connect it up and realise this is a single system. But understanding what's driving it is important. And again, that's a wicked problem, deeply entwined in the way. The cause of climate breakdown is rooted in the infrastructure we pass on between generations, because it was built carbon blind. Poorly insulated houses built miles from essential services, or things designed to break much earlier than is necessary, designed obsolescence. So this locks us into high carbon ways of doing things and the physical stuff we have around us. But it isn't just the physical stuff. Also culturally rooted in our mindset across many nations, humanity has been locked into high carbon lifestyles. The mindset of buy more, eat more, travel more, spend more. These have been cleverly associated with success and happiness, and so exert a deep, powerful influence, shaping our choices. So what are wicked solutions? Well, wicked solutions feed back on themselves. They scale up, they get cheaper, they get more widely deployed. Wicked solutions can ingrain themselves deeper into our physical and cultural landscapes, gaining more and more support. And although there's no single wicked solution, more are appearing all the time. So I'd like to run through some wicked solutions that we've been exploring at CAT over the past 15 years. Wicked solution number 1. An evidence-based positive vision unleashes new thinking. It begins to bring elements to life and opens new conversations. and to explore CAT's work in this area, the Zero Carbon Britain reports, they're all free to download from the CAT website. We model one possible endpoint where we've reached zero, and this involves two fundamental processes: powering down and powering up. Because we can't just have business as usual with PVs and electric vehicles. We need a genuine shift from energy-intense living. So by powering down, we explore a 60% reduction in the amount of energy we use to deliver society's goals. At the same time, we explore powering up 100% clean energy supply, modelling it hour by hour by hour using 10 years worth of data in buildings, transport, energy and land use. And then the small amount of residual emissions we can then balance off by revitalising natural systems. And we call this real zero. Wicked solution number 2 is also very exciting. Looking back over time, the cost falls we've seen in the technologies we need for the zero carbon transition are also feeding back on themselves. Rising demand causes increased investment in solar panels or onshore or offshore wind. This increasing investment means production costs fall, so they're viable in more places, the scale increases, so more people are interested in using them. More people interested in using them, this triggers further research, further cost falls, and it feeds back faster and faster. We need to bring this sort of feedback now to other areas like retrofit buildings. Wicked solution number 3. New leadership is feeding back. Backed by many citizens, local councils have declared a climate emergency and are taking action. But as one council declares or launches an action plan, other councils see it and they're inspired to follow suit. And then more councils see that. And looking at these two maps of Britain, it's spread at an enormous rate since 2019, to the point where 83% of councils have a plan. You can explore this in the climateemergency.uk website. But how does a council or a group or a church make actions happen? In our reports, Rising to the Climate Emergency, and in our teaching, we explore a model called the 4 directions. Firstly, the group can act downwards on the things it has direct control over, the food it buys for hospitals or the food you buy for a household. Secondly, you can act sideways. You can share good examples of what you've done with others and harvest good examples from other councils, other agencies, other groups, and begin to build a bit of a coalition between yourselves. Then for the things you don't have direct control over, you can lobby upwards for the change that you need. You can lobby your district council, county council, devolved government, national government. And the 4th direction is inwards. From the CEO downwards, you can have the basic training you need to make decisions differently. Thinking about anything from health and safety to data protection, if we want people to do things differently, we have to give the training. So training such as carbon literacy can actually empower and enable change by getting people to think differently. And this is outlined in chapter 4.5 of the most recent Zero Carbon Britain report. Wicked solution number 4 is very real-life innovative projects are growing across the UK. Communities, local governments, all sorts of agencies offer projects in transport, energy, buildings and land use which demonstrate how this can be achieved. And bringing it to life, seeing it in real life, cycling projects, energy projects, retrofit projects, helps you imagine it in your own town, your own city, your own high street. And to help with this sort of sharing, CAT's Digital Resource Hub is free to access and set up to cross-fertilise inspiration, tools, reports, guidance, training, webinars, and more to support your action. Wicked solution number 5 is probably the most exciting. Multi-solving. Now, if we're going to change things, then let's change things for the better. A multi-solving mindset means we identify synergies between changes needed to reach net zero and investments to create jobs, improve health and well-being, enhance biodiversity, reduce poverty, reboot the economy, increase our resilience and our ability to adapt to climate breakdown and other emergencies. Acting on climate with a multi-solving, it's an interdisciplinary mindset, can intertwine benefits across society and build a wider and more diverse coalition of support. So all of the tools that I've talked about, all of the 5 wicked solutions that are all growing and feeding back, you can access them via the Centre for Alternative Technologies website, cat.org.uk. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much to Paul for that presentation. Before we move on, we're just going to take a moment for reflection, and we're going to do this throughout the process when we've had, you know, a set of presentations, just to give you time to reflect on what you've heard, note down any key points. So we'll take that moment now. Okay, I hope that was enough time for everybody. So the next thing we're going to do is move you back into your small discussion groups, and this will be your opportunity to think about the questions you want to hear from the 3 recorded people that have given presentations this evening. So that's Councillor Ellie Chowns, Rachel Coxcomb from Climate Guide, and also Paul Allen from CAT. So you'll move into your groups now, and you'll have about 10 minutes to please come up with 2 of your top questions for each of those speakers. Thank you very much. Okay, are we all back in the room? Yeah, looks like we're all back, so that's great. You might be pleased to hear we've got a 5-minute break now, so please go and do whatever you need to do, go to the loo, make a cup of tea, stretch your legs, and then we'll be back in 5 minutes, so that's at 8:25, and then we're moving you straight into 3 groups where you'll get to talk to each of our speakers this evening. Okay, thanks everyone.
Hey, hi, welcome everyone back to the main group again. I appreciate that you know, that time went very quickly for a lot of people. Apologies to speakers if you got cut off halfway through answering a question. Just to reassure people, if there are any unanswered questions that you had asked the facilitators to share during that session, we will make sure that all unanswered questions do get a response, and we'll post that response on Basecamp. So if there's anybody sitting there thinking, oh, I didn't have the chance to ask my question or get it answered, we will be doing that. So just to reassure you of that, really. So we're conscious that we have really fed you with an awful lot of information on your first evening with us. The programme as we go through, it is busy, it is packed, there's an awful lot of information to share with you. So we hope that you're kind of taking notes as you go through, because that will be really helpful to be able to refer back to those things as we go through the forthcoming weekend and subsequent weekends. We're going to just take just a little breather. So we're going to keep you on screen and keep you engaged, but just kind of a little breather, just to kind of, you know, just stop the brains from whirring for a second. So just get you to go down to your reactions button again. We're going to be using this quite a lot throughout the course of the weekend that's coming up. Go back to reactions, and we're going to take a temperature reading of the room. Okay, so if you can just choose a reaction, an emoji, an icon, or something that basically shows me how you're feeling so far about your Citizens Assembly experience. I'm going to do it myself. I'm going to go through and just give myself, what am I feeling? So for me, I'm loving the experience, but you might say I'm quite biased. So just choose a reaction there that we can see. Tell us how you're finding it at the moment. Just go down to the bottom of that screen. Got a thumbs up from Esther. She's enjoying herself. Some smiley faces. Who else can I see? There's so many of you on the screen now. Okay. We've got some happy faces. Just choose that reaction that you can find, if you can find your little emojis down there. And as I say, as we go through, tomorrow we'll be using them a lot for voting and things. We'll be using the ticks and crosses that Max went through with you this morning. Winky face from Peter. He's hopefully we'll turn that into a smiley face by the end of the last weekend, Peter, hopefully. And just to remind you of the support that we've got on offer. Obviously, I know a few people have had a few technical problems tonight as we've gone through. That was inevitable. We're always going to have that with 48 people on a Zoom session. So Frances is there if you need her. Obviously, we've got the wellbeing support on hand, and we'll have somebody from March's counselling service on hand at every single session for people to be able to use them if they want to. So we are going to shortly start moving you through into your final exercise of the evening, and then I promise we will let you go. We'll let you crack open a bottle of wine, enjoy the rest of your evening. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with you to produce a set of conversation guidelines, and these guidelines are going to help you and inform the way that you have conversations with each other over the course of this Citizens' Assembly. So a key part of this process is about enabling people to have open discussions with each other, creating a space where people feel free to share very differing views and to challenge each other, but to do it in a really positive and constructive way. And that's going to require us to have respectful, constructive conversations with each other. So to help with that, we're going to develop a set of collective conversation guidelines. So we're going to work in our small groups again, back in those groups with our facilitators. And we're going to take a moment to think about conversations you've had recently, work with a group of people, and think about those conversations. Think about what made them a really positive experience for you. What made you feel valued in those conversations? Conversely, it might be things that actually think about, actually, I can remember having some really bad conversations in groups where people didn't listen to me and I didn't feel valued. So we're just going to start a conversation around some of what those guidelines might be. We're going to get you to draft some of those with your facilitator, use it on Jamboard. The facilitators are going to use Jamboard. We're not expecting you to use it tonight, but we will be getting you to use it on other sessions. And then what we'll do with those, once we've got them in draft, we'll review them all, have a look at them on Saturday, and we will play those guidelines back to you on Saturday morning, and you can vote on the ones that you want to be included in your Citizens' Assembly guidelines. So Max, are we good with groups? Good to go. Okay, so Max is going to put you into your small groups again now, and you're going to work with facilitators for about 10 minutes on those guidelines. Hi everybody and welcome back. I've just firstly an apology. We're running a bit over time tonight, but I'm just going to do a couple of minutes of wrapping up, and then you'll be free to continue your evenings. So I hope you found that session useful.
Oh, Claire, you're on mute.
Right, I'm going to start again. Thank you so much for coming back to us. We're in the last bit of this session now, so another couple of minutes. We're just going to do a wrapping up, and then we'll kind of send you on your way to enjoy the rest of your evenings. Apologies that we've run a bit over tonight. As standard, we won't be doing that. It's just as the first evening, we've been sort of catching up with ourselves a little bit in terms of some of the technology. So just to let you know, the conversation guidelines work you've just started, we are going to review all of that, and we're going to do some condensing of that, and we're going to collate it all and pull it together, and we will share that back with you early on Saturday morning, and get your input into shaping those conversation guidelines a little bit further. So the first thing I should say to you is a massive well done. You've got through session 1. There's been a lot of information fed to you tonight. So we appreciate it. It felt like quite an intensive and heavy session for your first one. Just to say, all the presentations from today's session will be put onto Basecamp. hopefully tomorrow. So if you do want to revisit anything, then you can do, but there's no expectation on you doing that. And we will do that after every session. So Saturday, that's our next session. We're going to hear more about climate change before we move on to looking at the themes. So Saturday morning will be climate change. Saturday afternoon, we're going to be looking at buildings. And then on Sunday, we'll move on to the two themes of transport and then food, farming and land use. Just a reminder that the Zoom login for Saturday's session will be sent to you on Saturday morning. So keep your eyes peeled for that. If you have had any problems today and you haven't had their unresolved and you want to talk to Frances, then obviously just let us know. Her contact details are in the welcome pack. And if you want to talk to anybody about anything to do with the sessions, then Max is the person to get in contact with. And I know you've got her contact details as well. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much for your input so far. We hope you found it a stimulating, an interesting evening. We're really, really excited about meeting you again on Saturday, and just enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much for your input.
Claire, Rich just had a comment there.
Oh, Rich?
I've just asked him to unmute, so hopefully he will unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, yes.
Yes, I've solved the problem, so Frances doesn't need to.
Okay, that's
Great.
brilliant. That's
Thanks.
great news. Okay, all right. I'm sorry you've struggled so much, but hopefully from now on in, it'll all be resolved. That's great.
My computer was defaulted to a microphone that it doesn't have.
Oh, okay.
Well
All right,
done,
so I'm going to
Rich.
let you enjoy the rest of your evening. So thank you once again, and we'll close the meeting now.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you on Saturday.
See you.